The air in the Hatcher & Sons John Deere dealership hung thick and heavy with the smell of new money. It was a cloying mix of fresh green paint, uncured rubber, and the faint ozonic hum of fluorescent lights on a polished concrete floor. It was a smell Arthur Jensen hated. It smelled like debt. He stood at the parts counter, a worn-out hydraulic seal in his calloused hand, feeling as out of place as a field mouse in a ballroom. Behind him, a low chuckle rumbled through the showroom. Still trying to keep that old museum piece running. Art. Art didn't have to turn around. He knew that voice. Rich Sterling. Rich had married the banker's daughter, and ever since, he'd farmed with the bank's checkbook instead of his own hands. He strutted around the county like he'd invented agriculture, his boots always a little too clean, his shirts always a little too new. Art placed the greasy seal on the counter. She runs just fine, Rich. Just needs a little persuasion now and then. Bill Hatcher, the owner of the dealership, leaned over the counter, a practiced, pitying smile on his face. Art, we've been over this. That 4010 of yours. It's a fine machine for its day. But its day was 15 years ago. We could put you in a new 4430 with a sound guard cab, air conditioning, a radio. You wouldn't know yourself. I know myself just fine, Bill, Art said, his voice low and even. And I know my checkbook. All I need is the seal kit for the main hydraulic pump. Part number AR26445, if I recall. Rich Sterling sauntered over, slapping a thick sheaf of papers on the counter right next to Art's greasy part. The top page was a bill of sale for a brand new 4630, gleaming under the lights not 20 feet away. It was a monster of a machine, a rolling testament to the power of a loan officer's signature. That's the problem, Art, Rich said, tapping the papers. You're thinking about today's checkbook. I'm thinking about next year's yields. You can't make money pinching pennies on parts. You got to invest. Leverage. That's the name of the game now. He puffed out his chest. Just signed for this beauty. And a new 20-foot disc to go with her. The bank was happy to do it. They see potential. The unspoken words hung in the air. And they don't see it in you. Bill Hatcher beamed at Rich, then glanced back at Art's worn flannel shirt and faded overalls. The comparison was stark. Art was the past, a black and white photograph. Rich was the future, in dazzling technicolor. He's right, you know, Bill said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if he were doing Art a favor. The interest rates are low. Commodity prices are headed for the moon. Fellas gotta expand or get left behind. We could work out the financing, wrap it all up in one neat payment. Art felt a slow burn starting in his gut. He'd heard this speech 100 times. At the co-op, at the diner, even at church. Get big or get out. Debt is a tool. The old ways are dead. He looked from Bill's eager face to Rich's smug one. He saw the gleam in their eyes, the hunger for the commission, for the bragging rights, for the validation that their way was the only way. He looked at the total on Rich's bill of sale, circled in red ink. $150,000. The number was so large it seemed unreal. It was more than his father had earned in his entire lifetime of breaking his back on the same piece of ground Art now worked. It was a mountain of obligation, a chain that wrapped around your ankles and stretched all the way to the bank in town. Rich saw him looking. Takes your breath away, don't it, old-timer? He smirked. But you got to spend money to make money. Art finally turned to face him, his blue eyes clear and steady. He held up his empty hands, showing the ingrained dirt and grease in the lines of his palms. You know, Rich, he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the showroom floor. My father taught me two things. First, how to turn a wrench on a piece of iron, until it does what you want it to. And second, never to let another man own my sweat before I've even broken it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, taking out 3 crumpled dollar bills and some change. He laid it on the counter. That seal kit is $2.87. That's the only payment I'm making today. Because this part, he tapped the money, is for a tractor that's mine. It sits on land that's mine. Free and clear, just like my father left it to me. He looked directly at Rich Sterling's boastful paperwork. I'll pay off my $150,000 today, because I don't owe it. Not a single red cent. A dead silence fell over the dealership. Bill Hatcher's smile froze on his face. Rich Sterling's jaw tightened, a flush creeping up his thick neck. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was sharp and dismissive. "Free and clear," Rich scoffed, shaking his head. "You call that farming? I call that a hobby. You can't compete with me running 30-year-old junk. You'll be a footnote in the county history book while I'm buying up the whole section." Bill Hatcher, sensing his commission was safe, joined in the laughter. It was a hollow, echoing sound under the high metal roof. "He's got you there, Art. You can't pay for your kids' college with pride." Art just looked at them, the laughter washing over him. He didn't get angry. He felt a deep, chilling sense of pity. They didn't get it. They couldn't. They saw a man in old clothes buying a cheap part for an old tractor. They didn't see a free man. He picked up his small paper bag with the new seal kit inside, leaving the money on the counter. "We'll see," he said, to no one in particular. He turned and walked out, the automatic door hissing shut behind him, leaving the 2 men and their laughter alone with the smell of new debt. As he climbed into his old Ford pickup, the engine turning over with a familiar, reliable rumble, he couldn't shake the sound of their mockery. It stung. There was no denying it. It was the collective voice of the new age, telling him he was a fool, a relic, a dinosaur waiting for the meteor. Now, before we go any further into this story, I need to ask you all something. Have you ever been in a position like that? Have you ever been laughed at for being careful with your money, for fixing something instead of replacing it, for sticking to the old ways when everyone else was chasing the new shiny thing? Let me know in the comments below. Because a man needs to know he ain't alone in this world when he's standing against the wind. Art drove the 5 miles home, the little bag with the hydraulic seal sitting on the seat beside him. The laughter from the dealership faded, replaced by the whine of the tires on the blacktop and the familiar rattle of his toolbox in the truck bed. Each mile that passed, the sting lessened, and a quiet resolve took its place. They thought he was a fool. Let them. Time would be the judge. His farm wasn't much by Rich Sterling standards. A quarter section, 160 acres, of good black Iowa soil, a modest white farmhouse, a big red barn with a fading coat of paint, a machine shed, and a few other outbuildings. It was the same spread his grandfather had homesteaded and his father had tamed. Every board, every nail, every fence post held a story. Art could walk the property blindfolded and tell you where the soil turned from loam to clay, where the water pooled after a hard rain, and where the pheasants were most likely to nest. He pulled into the lane, the gravel crunching under the tires. His workshop, a converted single-car garage attached to the machine shed, was his sanctuary. He backed the truck up to the wide door and got out, the smell of his own place washing over him, a mix of damp earth, diesel fuel, old oil, and the sweet scent of hay from the barn loft. It was the smell of solvency. Inside the machine shed sat his iron, his father's 1951 Farmall M, Its red paint faded to a dull orange, but its engine as sound as a dollar. Next to it was the patient, the 1963 John Deere 40-10, its big six-cylinder diesel engine silent, a puddle of hydraulic fluid slowly growing beneath its belly. He had other pieces, a John Deere 6600 combine he'd bought for cash at an auction, an old four-bottom plough, a cultivator. None of it was new, all of it was his. He clicked on the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling of his workshop. The space was meticulously organized. Wrenches hung in perfect order of size. Sockets sat in their designated trays. The workbench, built by his father from solid oak, was stained with the ghosts of 1,000 repairs. This was where Art Jensen was truly himself. Not a relic, but a craftsman. He changed into his greasiest overalls and got to work. The job was a bear. The main hydraulic pump on a 40-10 is tucked deep in the transmission case. To get to it, you had to drain nearly 20 gallons of high-guard fluid, a sticky, amber liquid that seemed to have a mind of its own, always finding a way to run down your arm. He worked a floor jack under the tractor's belly and slid underneath on a creeper, the cold concrete seeping through his shirt. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and old fluid. He worked by the light of a single drop light, his knuckles getting scraped and bruised on the tight clearances. Each bolt was a battle. Some were frozen with rust, others were slick with oil. He knew every one of them by feel. The 9/16 wrench for the cover plate, the 3 or 4 inch for the mounting bolts. He grunted and strained, the muscles in his back and shoulders protesting. This was the price of his independence. Rich Sterling would have just called the dealership. A young mechanic in a clean uniform would have come out in a service truck, billed him for $100 an hour, and been done in half the time. Art didn't have that luxury. His currency was sweat, patience, and a deep, intimate knowledge of his machinery. As he worked, he could hear the engine in his mind, could visualize the flow of oil, the movement of the pistons and valves. He wasn't just replacing a part, he was performing surgery. Hours passed, the sun set, and the cool night air crept into the shed. His wife, Mary, brought him out a sandwich and a thermos of hot coffee. She stood by the doorway, her arms crossed, a worried line on her forehead. "You'll be out here all night again, won't you?" she asked softly. "Just till it's done, Mare," he grunted from under the tractor. "Planting can't wait for a bad seal." "I saw Rich Sterling's wife in town," she said, her voice hesitant. She was talking about the new tractor and the trip to Florida they're planning for the winter. Art slid out from under the Deere, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was streaked with grease. "Good for them," he said, his voice flat. He took the sandwich and ate it in 3 bites, his eyes never leaving the machine. "Art," Mary said, her voice gentle. "Are we doing the right thing? Everyone else is expanding, taking loans. The paper says corn is going to $3 a bushel. Maybe they're right." He looked at her then, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the unshakable certainty. "They're gambling, Mary. They're betting the farm on high prices and low interest. They're playing poker with your father's money." He motioned toward the bank in town. "We're not gambling. This place is ours. No matter what the price of corn is, no matter what the bank says, this dirt is ours. That's a kind of wealth they don't understand." She nodded, though the worry didn't completely leave her eyes. She trusted him, but the whispers of the community were hard to ignore. At the church potluck, the other wives talked about new kitchen appliances and family vacations. Mary talked about canning the beans from her garden. They were seen as poor, as backwards, as failures. The scorn wasn't just at the dealership, it was everywhere. It was in the way the other farmers at the grain elevator would stop talking when Art walked up. It was in the condescending advice offered over the fence line. "You know, Art, if you'd just trade up, you could cover twice the acres in a day." He finished his coffee, the hot liquid a welcome warmth in his gut. "I'll get it done," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. He slid back under the tractor, back to his world of steel and oil, leaving her alone in the doorway with her doubts. By 3 a.m, his body screaming in protest, he had the new seal seated and the pump reassembled. He wrestled it back into place, the heavy iron fighting him every inch of the way. He tightened the last bolt, his muscles trembling with fatigue. He refilled the transmission with fresh fluid, checking for leaks with a flashlight. It was clean. The patient would live. He fired up the 4010. The big diesel engine coughed to life with a plume of black smoke, then settled into a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor and up into his bones. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. He climbed into the seat, worked the hydraulic lever, and the 3-point hitch rose smoothly and silently. He had won. It hadn't cost him a dime in labor, just a piece of himself. It was a price he was always willing to pay. The next few years seemed to prove Art Jensen wrong. The mid-1970s arrived like a golden age for the American farmer. The massive grain sales to the Soviet Union sent commodity prices skyrocketing. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling farmers to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. The mantra from Washington echoed the one from the Hatcher and Sons dealership: "Get big or get out." And Rich Sterling got big. He was the poster boy for the new era of agriculture. The profits from those first couple of boom years were staggering, but he didn't bank a penny of it. He used it as leverage. That $150,000 in debt seemed to vanish, replaced by a line of credit that appeared to have no ceiling. When Old Man Hemmings decided to retire, Rich bought his 240 acres without blinking, signing a mortgage at the prime rate, which was still a manageable 8%. With more land came the need for bigger equipment. The 4630 was soon joined by a brand-new John Deere 80C630, a massive 4-wheel-drive articulated tractor that looked like a locomotive sitting in his machine shed. He bought a new 7700 turbo combine with an 8-row corn head, a machine that could harvest more in an afternoon than Art's old 6600 could in 2 days. He built a towering new grain leg and a series of giant silver bins, allowing him to store his crop and play the market instead of selling at harvest time when prices were low. His farm became a local landmark. People would drive by on a Sunday just to look at the neat rows of new equipment, the massive grain setup, the perfectly maintained buildings. Rich was a success story. He was featured in the State Farming magazine. He was elected to the co-op board. He drove a new Lincoln Mark IV, and his wife wore a diamond ring that caught the sun from 50 yards away. And with every new purchase, with every acre he added, the unspoken judgment on Art Jensen grew heavier. Art was no longer just seen as old-fashioned. He was seen as a fool, a man who had been handed a golden opportunity and had been too timid, too stubborn to seize it. Art's farm, in contrast, looked almost exactly the same. The boom years were good to him, too. The high prices for his corn and soybeans meant he had more money in his pocket at the end of the year than he'd ever had before. But his reaction was profoundly different from Rich's. He didn't visit the bank. He visited the lumber yard. He put a new steel roof on the big red barn, a project that took him an entire summer. He replaced all the old wooden fence posts with new steel ones. He paid cash for a new-to-him but well-maintained haybine, allowing him to put up better quality feed for his small herd of Hereford cattle. He invested not in expansion, but in foundation. He poured money back into the soil, spreading lime and phosphate based on soil tests, building its fertility for the long term. He tiled a low-lying 20-acre patch that had always been too wet, a back-breaking job he did himself with a rented trencher. The biggest check he wrote was to the First National Bank of Liberty Creek, the final payment on the small operating loan his father had taken out years before his death. The day he made that payment, the teller had to ask the manager how to process it. They hadn't closed out a farm loan with a final payment in years. Most were just rolled over, bigger and bigger, year after year. At the diner, the talk was always of Rich Sterling's latest conquest. "Did you hear? Rich picked up the old Miller place. Got it for a steal." His new combine has a grain monitor in the cab. Tells him his yield in real time. Heard he's looking at land over in the next county now. Says a man can't have too much dirt. When Art walked in for his morning coffee, the conversation would sometimes falter. Men would nod at him, a touch of pity in their eyes. He was Art the Ark, diligently building his little boat while the sun shone and the forecast was clear. They were all on cruise ships, heading for paradise. One crisp autumn evening, Art was in his workshop, grinding the valves on the Farmall M's cylinder head. The radio on the shelf was murmuring in the background, a farm report droning on about hog futures. Mary came in with a piece of apple pie. "You work too hard," she said, setting it on the workbench. "Engine won't overhaul itself," he replied, not looking up from his work. "I was talking to Betty Sterling at the market," Mary said carefully. "She said they're paying an agricultural consultant now, a man from Des Moines. He tells Rich when to sell, when to buy futures, what chemicals to spray. She said farming is too complicated now to just do it yourself." Art carefully placed a freshly lapped valve back into the head. He could feel the perfect, airtight seal. He looked at the simple, rugged design of the Farmall engine. It was complicated enough, but it was a complexity he could understand, a complexity he could master with his own 2 hands. "There's a difference between complicated and complex, Mary," he said. "What I do here is complicated. It takes skill and patience. What Rich is doing, that's complex. It's a web of loans and interest rates and government programs and faraway markets. And the thing about a web is, a spider can get caught in it just as easily as a fly." The voice on the radio changed. It was a newscaster now, his tone serious. Inflation continues to be a major concern for the administration, with the annual rate now approaching double digits. In Washington, sources say the Federal Reserve Chairman is contemplating drastic measures to cool the overheating economy, including a significant and sustained increase in the federal funds rate. Art stopped his work. He turned and listened, a cold knot forming in the pit of his stomach. Double-digit inflation, drastic measures. He knew what that meant. It meant the cost of everything. Fuel, fertilizer, parts was going to go up. And more importantly, it meant the cost of borrowing money was about to go through the roof. He looked out the workshop door, across the darkened fields toward the distant glow of Rich Sterling's farm, where massive floodlights illuminated his new grain bins. Rich was a king in his castle, a castle built on a foundation of cheap debt. Art looked down at his own hands, at the simple, solid piece of iron on his workbench. A cold wind rattled the window panes, a harbinger of the winter to come. For the first time in a long time, Art Jensen felt a sliver of fear. Not for himself, but for his neighbors. They were dancing on the deck of a beautiful new ship, laughing and celebrating their good fortune, and not one of them seemed to notice the icebergs looming in the dark water ahead. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was a slow, creeping rustle, like a dry wind through a parched cornfield. The news reports from Washington turned from murmurs to a steady drumbeat. The Federal Reserve, under its new chairman, a man with a spine of steel named Paul Volcker, had declared war on inflation. The prime lending rate, the number that had fueled Rich Sterling's empire, began to climb. It went from 8% to 10, then 12, then 15. Each tick upwards was like another turn of a thumbscrew on the farmers who had borrowed heavily. Art felt it in small ways at first. The price of a 55-gallon drum of 15W40 oil went up by $10. The cost of the hybrid seed corn he favored jumped 20%. He saw the worry etched on the faces of his neighbors at the co-op. The confident talk of expansion was replaced by hushed, anxious conversations about operating loans and input costs. Rich Sterling, however, seemed immune. He drove his Lincoln with the same casual arrogance, his new equipment still gleaming in the sun. He'd had his loans locked in, he told people at the diner. He was insulated. His consultant in Des Moines was a genius, telling him to hold his grain because the Russian embargo would be short-lived and prices would rebound stronger than ever. The giant silver bins on his property were full to the brim, a monument to his market savvy. Then, one sweltering day in late July, the real thunderclap came. It wasn't financial, it was mechanical. Art was cultivating his soybeans with the old 4010, the engine thrumming its steady, reliable rhythm, when he saw it. Over on the horizon, on the vast, flat expanse of what used to be the Hemmings farm, Rich Sterling's John Deere 8630 sat dead in the middle of the field. It was an unnatural sight, like a beached whale. The massive tractor, the pride of the county, was silent. A day passed, then 2. The tractor didn't move. On the 3rd day, Art saw the Hatcher & Sons service truck parked beside it. A young mechanic in a clean green uniform was staring at the engine compartment, a look of profound confusion on his face. Art knew that look. It was the look of a man who knew how to replace parts, but not how to diagnose a problem. That evening, Art drove into town for a bag of feed. Bill Hatcher was behind the parts counter himself, his face grim. The usual confident salesmanship was gone, replaced by a weary frustration. "Can't get a thing done," Bill grumbled, not to Art specifically, but to the air itself. "My best mechanic is out at Sterling's place. Has been for 3 days. Can't figure out what's wrong with that damn 80-AG30. Thing's got more wiring in it than the telephone exchange." "What's it doing?" Art asked, his curiosity piqued. "It's not doing anything, that's the problem," Bill snapped. "Cranks but won't fire. We think it's the injection pump, a Rusa Master DB2. You know what a new one of those costs? $4,000. And that's if we can even get one. Everything's on back order." Art nodded slowly. He knew the pump. It was a complex piece of machinery, a marvel of engineering when it worked, and a nightmare when it didn't. You couldn't just fix it with a wrench and some common sense. It required special tools, a clean room, and a level of expertise that the young mechanic in the field simply didn't have. "Rich is fit to be tied," Bill continued, rubbing his temples. "He's got 150 acres of beans left to cultivate, and the weeds are coming on strong. Every day that tractor sits, it's costing him yield." Art paid for his feed and left. As he drove home, he thought about the $4,000 injection pump. That was more than he'd paid for his entire 6600 combine. He thought about his own 4010 with its simple, reliable mechanical pump. If it ever failed, he could rebuild it on his workbench in a day for less than $100 in parts. Rich had bought power and efficiency, but he had also bought dependency. He was tethered to the dealership, to their schedule, to their prices, to the global supply chain. He had outsourced his own self-reliance. A week later, the 8630 was finally running again. They'd had to truck it back to the dealership and install the new pump. The bill, Art heard, was closer to $6,000 after labor and transport. It was a staggering sum, a crack in the polished facade of Rich's operation. For the first time, people saw that the new iron could bleed money just as fast as it could make it. The cracks began to spread. The grain embargo held. Corn prices didn't rebound, they softened, then began to fall. Meanwhile, interest rates continued their relentless climb, hitting 18, then 20%. Rich Sterling's variable rate loans, the bedrock of his expansion, had become a millstone around his neck. The monthly interest payment on his land debt alone was now more than most farmers' entire annual income. The consultant from Des Moines stopped answering his calls. The genius had vanished. Rich was forced to sell his stored grain at a loss just to make the interest payments. The money he got wasn't a profit. It was a transfusion to keep the beast of debt alive for another month. The confidence drained from his face, replaced by a haunted, hunted look. The swagger was gone. He stopped coming to the diner for morning coffee. The laughter had died in his throat. The winter of 1981 was brutal, not just in its weather, but in its economics. The new year brought no relief. Commodity prices continued to slide, while the cost of money remained astronomically high. Land values, which had been inflated to absurd levels by the speculative buying of the boom years, suddenly collapsed. A farmer's net worth was tied to his land equity. Overnight, men who had been millionaires on paper were technically bankrupt. Their collateral was worth less than their loans. The letters from the bank started arriving in mailboxes all over the county. They were printed on crisp, formal letterhead, but their message was as blunt as a sledgehammer. Loans were being called in. Payment schedules were being accelerated. The bankers who had once been partners in prosperity, slapping farmers on the back and encouraging them to borrow more, were now cold-eyed accountants demanding their due. Rich Sterling's wife, being the banker's daughter, bought him a little time, but not much. Family ties were no match for the realities of a balance sheet that was bleeding red ink. The bank had its own pressures, its own auditors to answer to. Rich was too big to fail on his own. He was a liability that threatened the entire institution. The first public notice appeared in the classified section of the county newspaper in early spring. It was an auction bill, the property of Richard Sterling. The list of equipment was breathtaking. The John Deere 8630, the 7700 turbo combine, the 20-foot disc, planters, cultivators, grain trucks, a whole kingdom of green and yellow iron to be sold to the highest bidder. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a raw March wind whipping across the farmstead. The entire county was there, it seemed. They came not to celebrate, but to bear witness, like townspeople gathered for a public execution. They walked among the rows of machinery, kicking the tires, their faces grim. This wasn't just Rich's equipment. It was their own ambition, their own dreams, now sitting with a numbered tag on it, waiting to be sold for pennies on the dollar. Rich stood near the house, a ghost of the man he had once been. His expensive shirt was rumpled, his face pale and drawn. His wife stood beside him, her face a mask of strained composure. The diamond ring was gone from her finger. Art saw Bill Hatcher from the dealership standing off to one side, looking miserable. He wasn't there as a friend. He was there on behalf of John Deere Credit to make sure the bank got its share from the sale of the financed equipment. Art walked the line of machinery, his heart heavy. He felt no triumph, no vindication. He just felt a profound sadness. This was a tragedy. He stopped by the massive 8630. It looked powerful and inert, its new injection pump a tiny, expensive heart inside a dead giant. It had been a tool of prosperity, but it had also been a weapon of self-destruction. The auctioneer began his rhythmic, hypnotic chant. The crowd was quiet, the bids slow and reluctant. These were not buyers flush with cash. They were survivors picking through the wreckage, looking for a bargain that might help them hang on for one more season. The 8630, which had cost Rich over $100,000 just a few years before, sold for $30,000. The combine went for even less. It was a bloodbath. Art watched it all, his hands in his pockets. He didn't bid. He didn't need anything. His own shed was full of older, smaller equipment that was fully paid for. While Rich had been making massive payments on his new iron, Art had been putting his profits in the bank, earning interest in a savings account. It wasn't a lot of money by Rich's old standards, but in this new, brutal economy, cash was king. As the auction wound down, Art saw something that made his stomach clench. Tucked away behind the machine shed was a smaller tractor. It was an old John Deere 4020, weathered and faded, with a simple open station. It had clearly been Rich's utility tractor, the one he used for smaller jobs. It was the tractor he had likely started with before the borrowing began. It looked honest and solid, much like Art's own 4010. The auctioneer moved to the 4020. The bidding was slow. It started at $2,000. Art watched Rich's face. As the bidding climbed to $3,000, then $4,000, he saw a flicker of hope in Rich's eyes. This one piece of iron, this remnant of his old life, might be something he could afford to buy back, a piece of his dignity. But then another bidder jumped in, a large operator from the next county who was known for being ruthless. He ran the price up to $5,000, then $6,000. Art saw the hope drain from Rich's face, replaced by utter despair. He was going to lose everything. Art had never bid at an auction in his life. He hated the spectacle of it. But he looked at Rich, a man broken by the very system that had built him up, and he felt a kinship, not with the arrogant farmer in the dealership, but with the man standing there watching his life be sold off piece by piece. They were both sons of this soil. $7,000, Art said. His voice was quiet but clear, and it cut through the auctioneer's chant. A murmur went through the crowd. Heads turned. The big operator from the next county looked over at Art, surprised. He bid $7,500. $8,000, Art said immediately, his voice stronger this time. The operator hesitated. He looked at the old tractor, then back at Art's determined face. He shook his head and stepped back. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, pointing his gavel at Art. "For $8,000 to Arthur Jensen." The crowd parted as Art walked to the clerk's trailer to pay. He wrote out the check from his savings account, his hand steady. When he came back, Rich was standing by the 4020, running a hand over its faded green fender. He didn't look at Art. "You didn't have to do that," Rich said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," Art said. "You came to gloat, to see me get what I deserved." Art shook his head. "No, Rich, I didn't. I came because you're my neighbor." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, a simple, handwritten rental agreement he'd drawn up the night before. "I'm renting out my North 40 this year. I need a good man to farm it for me. I'll provide the seed and fertilizer. You provide the labor. We'll split the crop 50-50. You'll need a tractor." He held out the keys to the 4020. Rich stared at the keys, then at the piece of paper, then at Art's face. He saw no pity, no condescension. He saw only a simple, honest offer, a lifeline. For the first time in years, Rich Sterling's eyes filled with tears. He couldn't speak. He just took the keys, his hand trembling, and nodded. The auction was the turning point for the whole community. The myth of debt-fueled growth had been shattered, and the wreckage was plain for all to see. In the years that followed, the lessons of the crisis settled deep into the bones of the people who remained. The word leverage became a curse. The sight of a brand new piece of equipment didn't inspire awe anymore. It inspired suspicion. Art Jensen, the man they had once dismissed as a relic, became a quiet legend. His farm, which had seemed so small and insignificant during the boom, now looked like a fortress of stability. He had survived not by getting bigger, but by getting stronger. His wealth wasn't in his acreage, but in his freedom. He started doing repair work for his neighbors. Men who couldn't afford the dealership's rates would limp their old tractors into Art's yard. He'd work on them in his shop, his hands moving with the familiar grace of a master craftsman. He never charged much, just enough to cover his time and parts. He wasn't running a business, he was tending to his community. He was helping them keep their old iron alive, just as he had kept his own. Rich Sterling farmed Art's North 40 for 5 years. He worked harder than he ever had in his life, not with the frantic energy of a man chasing a profit, but with the quiet diligence of a man rebuilding his soul. He used the old 4220, learning its quirks, learning how to fix it himself with Art's guidance. The two men, once rivals, became friends. They would talk for hours, not about markets or futures, but about the soil, the weather, and the simple, profound satisfaction of a straight furrow. Eventually, Rich saved enough money to buy a small 80-acre farm of his own, a few miles down the road. It was a modest place, but it was his, free and clear. One sunny afternoon in the late 1980s, Art was in his workshop, this time with his grandson, a boy of 10 named Michael. He was showing the boy how to set the gap on a spark plug for the old Farmall M. "Why don't we just get a new tractor, Grandpa?" Michael asked, his small hands fumbling with the feeler gauge. "Like the ones in the magazines, with a computer inside?" Art smiled. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. "This tractor," he said, patting the Farmall's worn red fender, "has a story. It belonged to your great-grandfather. He bought it brand new in 1951. He paid for it with 2 years of good corn crops. When he was done, it was his. Nobody could take it from him." He pointed to the 4010, sitting in the shed. "That one's mine. I've overhauled the engine twice and rebuilt the transmission from the ground up. I know every bolt on it. It doesn't have a computer, but it has something more important. It has no debt attached to it. It runs on diesel fuel and my sweat, not on a bank loan." A familiar pickup truck pulled into the lane. It was Rich Sterling. He got out, looking older, his hair graying at the temples, but his face was relaxed and content. He carried a small box. "Morning, Art," he said with a warm smile. "Found this at a flea market. Thought of you." He handed Art the box. Inside, nestled in cotton, was a pristine, new old stock hydraulic seal kit. Part number AR2SIC4455, the same part that had started it all so many years ago in the dealership. Art looked at the part, then at his old friend, and he laughed. It was a deep, genuine laugh that came from a place of peace. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Might just need that in another 10 years or so." Rich looked at Michael, busy with the spark plug. "You teaching him the right way?" "I'm trying," Art said. "Trying to teach him that the real value of a thing isn't what it costs, but what it means to own it yourself. The goal isn't to be the biggest farmer in the county. It's to be a free man on your own piece of land and to pass it on to the next one in better shape than you found it." Rich nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "That's a lesson that costs a lot to learn," he said quietly. "More than any tractor." The two men stood there for a moment in the comfortable silence of shared history. The sun warmed the dusty air of the workshop. The smell of old oil and fertile earth hung around them. Outside, the fields stretched out, green and promising, under a vast blue sky. Art looked from his grandson's focused face to the solid iron of the old tractors, to the peaceful land that was his, truly his. He had never bought the whole section. He had never been a footnote in the history book. He had simply endured. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.